So you've got a Blues Junior. You're trying to get a good sound out of it, but you're getting frustrated dialing it in, and you're just not getting it to sound good. It might sound a little bit harsh, it might sound a little bit boxy. Whatever the case is, here are a few cardinal rules as to how to get a great tone out of the Fender Blues Junior. These are basic rules that really apply to any genre that you're playing. I've done several videos on how to get a lot of different tones out of the Blues Junior, genre-specific tones all across the board. You can check those out if you want to learn how to dial it in that way. This is not that. This is actually kind of a do's and don'ts as far as how to get a good tone out of it no matter what genre you're doing. Rule number 1, don't use the fat switch as a basis for your tone. All right, what do I mean by that? Am I saying don't use the fat switch? Not necessarily. Although honestly, I would strongly advise against it. You get way more range out of your EQ. You get a cleaner, softer, and more dynamic sound if you don't turn the fat switch on. Now, is the fat switch unusable? No, absolutely not. And particularly if you're playing in a live setting, you can get a really cool, powerful boost out of it. What I think generally about the fat boost is it makes everything a little bit too much more, right? So any of you use Instagram or any type of run-of-the-mill photo filter. Let's say you kick up the saturation a little bit. It boosts your color and things look a little bit brighter, a little bit, more, there's a little more oomph to the color. But then you push it a little bit more and then the color starts looking fake and it starts to kind of hurt your eyes almost. That's what the fat switch does to the Blues Junior. It makes everything more, but it can be at a point where it's a little like, it's not quite terrible, but it's going in that direction. Now, if you're playing mostly clean, it's not actually as big a deal. I found that the fat switch is more usable clean. If you're playing overdriven, I think it makes a big difference. So what are some alternatives? Well, one alternative is to dial in your tone with your volume rolled back a little bit, and then if you need a boost, pull up your volume. Okay, that's pretty standard guitar 101 for anyone who's performing. The other thing, and this is my favorite, is to use some kind of a pedal with it. So today I'm using a one control Persian green screamer on its modern setting, which does something kind of similar to what the fat boost on the Fender does. It's going to give me a little bit of a mid boost, not quite in a tube screamer way because I have it on the modern mode, but this will hopefully give you a good indication of how it sounds. So I'm going to give you a couple clips here with just the regular Blues Junior with a fat switch off, and then kick the fat switch on, and then also hear it with the pedal. We're going to do this both clean and overdriven so you can really hear what it sounds like. So you can hear it made less of a difference clean, but I still think it made a difference to use the pedal. It sounded a little softer in a good way. It was a little bit rounder around the edges with a hint more compression. The Blues Junior, when you kick on the fat switch, it's just really raw and there's just a lot. And I think there are some great alternatives to using the fat switch. Rule number 2, use the reverb sparingly. I always keep the reverb set to very low when I use the Blues Junior if I have it on at all. Many players are going to get blindsided by the fact that this is a Fender tube amp with real spring reverb in it. That's it. It's got to be good. Here's the thing. It's not a super reverb. I'm not crazy about the reverb on this amplifier, but I'm not going to say that it sounds bad because that's subjective. And the reason I don't like it is because it's a little too specific a sound. It sounds very, very vintagey. It sounds very, very bright and splashy. Now, when you pair that with the fact that there can be some harsh frequencies depending on how you dial in the EQ, the reverb can really reflect some of those harsh overtones. So if you're pushing a lot of treble and mids, it's not going to sound good with that reverb. It sounds like a surf rock reverb. Or like an old vintage blues reverb if you duck out all the bass and then kind of push the reverb and then get that really old blues sound. Now, are those good tones? Yeah, those are good tones. Those are really cool tones. Thing is a lot of players who are getting the Blues Junior aren't going to be going for surf or vintage blues tones. And probably a lot of players going for more modern tones with this amp. And, you know, obviously this looks like kind of a vintage amp, this one being the Tweed. By the way, this is a Tweed Blues Junior 3 that you're looking at. Some of these tips could vary depending on the Blues Junior model that you're using. Some you may have more range on the reverb, some you may have less range on the reverb, some you may love the fat switch, and some the fat switch may be, you know, point is, this is a Blues Junior 3, that's what we're taking a look at. A lot of players are going to love it for its vintage vibe, and yet still want to be playing modern music. If you want to get that tone, you need to soften it a little bit, and you probably don't want oodles of that vintage springy sound. You might like it a little bit. So what I like to do is I like to keep the reverb on very, very low, just so that my signal's not dry, and then kick on a reverb pedal. Now, some of you who don't do pedals, you want to just have this as a grip and rip sort of amp, plug and play, kind of, you know, swing and fling, dine and dash. You can do all those things too. I would still say use the reverb sparingly. I wouldn't get this amp if you want a big, lush reverb sound unless you're looking for that vintage sound specifically. So I'm going to give you a clip here on how I like to use it with the reverb, which is to keep the reverb on a little bit low, and then if I want more reverb for more of an atmospheric tone. I don't quite get into ambient, but an atmospheric tone, I'm going to kick on a one control Prussian blue reverb, and you'll hear how I think that the reverb pedal really does a better job getting more of a modern sound than the onboard spring reverb. All right, now for a couple of last housekeeping rules. Rule number 3, keep the mids and the treble at or below 6, which is half. This amp goes to 12. Where you run into trouble generally EQ-wise with this amp is with the treble and the middle. Now this can vary depending on guitar. If you have certain types of guitars or certain types of settings or whatnot, you may get a little more range out of it, you may get a little less range out of it. Really depends on what you're playing, so keep that in mind. Also depends on what model Blues Junior you have and what speaker you have. But in general, the bass you have a lot more range on. The bass is kind of like a size knob, I think, for this amp. If you pull the bass, it sounds like a small, in the studio, little old-fashioned tube amp box. If you push the bass, it can sound like a much bigger amp because it has a 12-inch speaker. The mids, here's the thing. This is already a really mid-rangey amp, so you don't need to emphasize that too much. This is also part of the problem with the fat switch. The fat switch just kind of emphasizes that a little bit more. Because you already have a lot of inherent mid-range, you don't need to add any extra in. Now, if you push the mid-range, it doesn't get quite as harsh as the treble might. However, it can really start sounding boxy. A lot of people complain that the Blues Junior sounds too boxy. Back off the mids. It's not a scooped sound. It's really not. A lot of players will be hesitant to back off the mids because they'll kind of think psychologically, well, that's that scooped sound. That's not what I'm going for. I'm going for that, blues or classic rock type sound. You can back off the mids a fair amount and still get a really nice tone. So I don't like to push the mids beyond 6. And the same with the treble. Now the treble, you've got a lot of clarity on this amp. You've got a lot of brightness. So it's the same kind of situation as with the mid-range. If you push the treble too much, it just gets really brash and hard to listen to, and your audience is going to develop ear fatigue very quickly. But that's about where the threshold I found is. I don't really like to push the mids or the treble beyond 6. Bass you have a lot more range on. Again, it depends on the guitar that you're using, and it does depend on this one last trick. Ride your volume and your tone knobs. Your volume and your tone knobs on your guitar are there for a reason. Now, this is really not a specific tip to the Blues Junior. This is actually a pretty good tip for a lot of different amplifiers. But for instance, on most of these clips you're hearing, I have my volume ducked to 9 on my guitar. The guitar that I'm playing today is the brand new Fender Player Plus Stratocaster, by the way. Here's what I will say about that. It softens it just enough, and it always gives you that last little bit of oomph if you need it, if you're playing live, to just kind of kick it up a notch. Now you can go further than this if you want. You can duck your volume back to 7, down to 5. You can do all kinds of different things with getting different tones with your volume and your tone knobs. But in general, I would say set the basis for your tone with the volume backed off a little bit. In other words, where you want your home bass tone to be, where you're just setting up to play, that's where you're going to have your volume backed off a little bit. And then kind of like the fat switch. If you are going to use the fat switch, don't think of it as the basis of your tone. Think of it as an add-on when you need a boost. It's the same with the volume. Keep the volume backed off a little bit and then just pull it up when you need that little bit of extra. Now I'm going to do one honorable mention, which I'm not going to go over today, and I'll tell you why. It's because I don't like this method. However, many players do like this method. So out of respect to them, I do want to bring this up, and that is to turn the master volume all the way up, effectively taking it out of the equation. Then it really acts like a more vintage amplifier. So you turn the master volume all the way up, and then your volume, rather than acting like just a gain knob, acts like just a volume knob. Here's the reason I don't like it. The reason I don't like it is because it raises the noise, and again, it just makes everything a little bit more. I found that doing that, even at lower volumes, the notes were still a little too brash around the edges, even at low volumes where it's still completely clean. It was noisy and a little bit brasher than I liked. However, again, I did want to bring that up because a lot of players like it, and mine is certainly not the only opinion. I'm just trying to share a few tips that I personally like to make the Blues Junior a more usable and more pleasant to listen to amplifier. So that's what I have to say about this. Please let us know in the comments below. How do you dial in your Blues Junior? What model Blues Junior do you have? Do you have the 3? Do you have an older one? Do you have the 4? Do you have a limited edition one with a different speaker? Let us know in the comments. I'm Jack Fossett. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe, and we'll see you next time.